What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the Elder Scrolls podcast. I'm Scott, as always, here with Michael and Drew. And today we are talking all about the 9 divines, or 8 divines, depending on your political persuasion, I suppose. But we'll start getting into it, but I just want to throw out one sort of parameter. We're going to try and keep this a little more grounded in the sort of imperial understanding of the divines. So we're not talking about just the Aedra broadly. Like, we'll bring them up, other interpretations occasionally to sort of contrast them. But we're going to keep it, Talos, Akatosh, Arche, that kind of thing. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start with, like, the biggest hitters? Or do we actually want to start with some of the...
Well, how about starting with some actual lore on the divines and how they were created in the first place? A little bit of an overview of how obviously we had Saint Alicia make these divines because she had help with her slave rebellion from the Nords, but then the Needs, they had the old Mary pantheon because they just took the pantheon of their overlords, and then to kind of like make everyone get on, which... it kind of sounds silly when you think about it. Like, I don't think Nords would be, like, happy with any changes. But she did get all of the kind of pantheons and blur it into her own one.
To be honest, I actually would say, like, it's probably even a little bit more human-flavored anyway. Just because...
Than Elven. It is.
Yeah.
But just changing gods in general, I would find strange. Like, there's a line somewhere that's like, oh, it wasn't exactly the same, but it was good enough for the Nords.
I feel like if you had if you saw it happen, I feel like the change would have been a little bit more gradual. Like, for example, like very first incarnation of, say, like, Kinnereth, like they might start calling Kinnereth and so on, but I feel like it would have been a few like generations of worship where it kind of shifts and changes, not like this instantly, okay, now she's all soft and...
Well, that is important context. Like the idea that initially when founding the religion, you've got a bunch of former slaves who kind of somewhat through Stockholm syndrome, but it's also all they know, are used to elven gods. But a couple of generations later, the great-grandkids of those former slaves don't really need heavy elven elements in it. It's kind of just, I guess it's just a way to reconcile everything. And then the 9 divines as we see them now, they're elven elements and even their Nordic elements seem very disconnected.
And I mean, if you actually look at the divines too, the other thing to consider is maybe the divines that we know today, like the 8 divines, like in concept were created by Alicia, but the whole rising of the Elysian order and making that the dominant faith and the 8 divines sort of like a component of that might be very different compared to, say, like the imperial cult that exists afterward through the Riemann empires and Septim empires. Like, if you consider in the real world, like look at Christianity or all Abrahamic religions or so, starting, I guess it's Judaism or whatever ages ago, but then you've kind of got like the formation of Christianity, the formation of Islam, and then you've got the splits within those. You've got the sort of Anglican and Catholic and Orthodox and all Eastern Orthodox and all of that. Like, you can imagine a similar sort of thing somewhat, like that basically time and different cultures and stuff will have an effect on the gods. Even if as a concept, the Christian God has still been a Christian God since Jesus, like the idea, but you know what I mean?
It is kind of like having a reformation because, in the early days, more so for the Nords, but you could say so for the elves too, is the worship of these gods is very, very dogmatic, and with the Nords it's very animalistic and like these totems that they revere. And when you've got Shor leading the charge, who's a very aggressive god who hates the elves, these kind of things needed to be kind of nerfed a bit and like toned down for everyone to live in a cosmopolitan society. So it's kind of like a reformation in like getting rid of, like, when you imagine it with Christianity and Catholicism, you kind of had to take away some of the really rigorous, strict elements of the religion and make it so that kind of everyone could, like worship it, but it's not be so like ingrained in every aspect.
And if
of
you
your
do
life.
look at a lot of the divines too, they are very like... cosmopolitan's a word that we throw around all the time, but I mean, like, it's kind of one size fits all. Like, they're not too restrictive. Like,
they're not controversial, I guess, is a good way to look at it. There's nothing that you hear in the 9 divines teachings that you're like, oh my gosh, that's so crazy. And I guess that's why a lot of people don't find them to be the most interesting group of gods compared to other ones. Like, you know, you go look at the Dunma pantheon and how they will talk about betrayal and like manipulation and interesting concepts instead of just above all else, be good to one another. You know?
Yeah, it is kind of utilitarian in a sense. It's just good for their society. And you can, I mean, even with the idea of Tiber Septim being immortalized as Talos in their pantheon, you can kind of tell with the divines that if people worship this god or this figure, then whatever, just allow it. They can be part of the divines. It's like if they've got worshippers, then what's wrong with allowing them to be worshipped and venerating them? Whereas then you get the elves coming in with they're like, you know, no, this is the way it's done. We don't want some human joining the pantheon. That's, you know, it's heresy. And you can see where the divines is kind of just like, we're not getting caught up in all that heresy and sacrilege. And it's just, you know, if you want to worship them and it's got a good value on society.
Also, I feel like another reason they
to
have to be, besides just different, like so muted and not really like, they don't have a big cultural persuasion like, you know, Kine or something like that. There's a very Nordic feeling thing. It's just also early Nibonese culture. You had all of these like many different cults, and around the time of the Elysian Order, there was heaps of stuff going around. The obviously 8 divines, the imperial cult sort of was one of the more popular ones, but you can see how it could you know raise itself to a state of popularity because it was very like fits all and wasn't, I guess, exclusionary, except obviously with Daedra, but that's pretty standard fare.
But it's easy to make them exclusionary when you can paint the Daedra as these evil, crazy like things that, to be fair, like on a wide scale, except in, you know, the different pantheons around Tamriel, but in Cyrodiil in particular, if you go look at the different shrines and the cults and stuff, like a lot of them do get kind of screwed over by their Daedra overlords. Like it's not, you're not necessarily going into the best deal. I mean, I find it interesting actually that the Needs would even worship the elven gods in the first place, despite the Stockholm syndrome. Like, what are they doing in terms of religion? Like, they're constantly being like hurt and I guess.
But I guess it's the same
tortured.
as like slaves would believe in like Rome could believe in Roman gods.
But did they get time? Did they get time for religion? It's just an interesting idea. Did they have temples? Or were they just kind of praying in shackles and?
Well, to add on to what you're getting at there, if you're looking at the religion in Somerset, you've got Auriel lead, the head of the pantheon, and it's very much their culture is based, this is generally speaking, but their culture is based around the idea that they have a connection to Auriel and the high elves are superior and belong back in Ephirius, in the heavens. And then even with the Nords, you've got Kine, who breathed the Nords onto the throne of the world. And if you're not a Nord or if you're not a high elf, some of these gods don't really mesh with you personally. But if you imagine in Cyrodiil, say you've got a mishmash of different races all living in Cyrodiil, and then you think, Mara, she's the goddess of love, compassion, the bounty of nature. Everyone cares about their crops being healthy. This applies to everyone. It's not like, no, the Imperials are superior kind of religion.
Oh, yeah. The Talos as well, worship of Talos can be useful too, because it is like a ambition figure and a kind of like, transcendence idea, putting that into the culture. Like you can overcome.
It helps put faith in the emperor as well, whoever is the ruling monarch. It's like, this is how important they are to our culture.
To provide more like potential context to the idea of the slaves accepting like the elven gods and so on, and because they were just born into it, it's also like, I guess, looking at slavery kind of different to how we do in the modern world and in our recent history, where it was very like economical or like sort of transactional or based on stuff. Like a lot of ancient slavery was, and you could even look at India, and a lot of ancient India and stuff is a good example of this, and caste systems and stratification of society. The stratification of society and the place of slaves was kind of something like associated with the religion and the gods itself. So they could be looking at Auriel, and like Auriel, they worship their god and so on, but they kind of feel like their place as slaves is ordained by the gods, and it is made so by them. Like, so their relationship changes. It's a bit different, you know what I mean? Like it's not necessarily like the sort of,
it makes sense if you're told that you're like the bottom of the food chain essentially.
You're part of that society, as opposed to being stolen from somewhere else.
And you grow up in
like
it,
that.
and your religion dictates to you that you are bottom of the food chain, then you'll believe that, I suppose.
And the other thing, I guess, to throw out there, because I imagine the cruelty would change depending on the Aelid kingdoms, but like there's a lot of your base elven gods, which were the Aedric ones. But then you've also got like the Daedric ones worshipping the Daedric princes, and they were the places of like, immeasurable cruelty.
Yeah.
That's where it's really happening, Because they still lead
they
to
could even think that the gods have forsaken them in a way, or that their elven overlords have become, I guess, less adherent to their own religion.
Yeah.
And I can see that.
But it's interesting. A lot of the gods still, they're not very elven. Like even Akatosh being like, I mean, we can get into this a little bit, but Akatosh being like, originally an interpretation of Auriel / Alduin / sort of like a mix, you know what I mean? You're bringing in the sort of dragon element, which also, like, I feel like to the Nords, the bringer of time and end of times and so on, like Alduin wouldn't be a good figure. Actually, also, considering that the dragon, maybe this is a bit of a lore problem, but like, consider that this creation of the 8 divines is happening in like the year 200 and something of the first era, whereas Isgramor's arrival was only sort of like 500 years before the start of the first era or something like that. So then you've kind of got in between those 700 years of time, there was like Alduin running around with his dragon cult and dominating the Nords of Skyrim. I feel like they really would have had a recent experience with dragons being bad.
You'd have the flashbacks of like, I remember the last time we decided to worship dragons. Didn't go very well.
Well, actually, exactly. The dragon cult was being exterminated in the early first era.
Yeah.
So it's still like around. So it's kind of
it's a bit dicey. But I mean, the whole thing is shrouded in mystery. Even the whole concept that Akatosh kind of came to Elysia in a vision, when Akatosh, in the way that she supposedly constructed it for the Divine's religion, didn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, Akatosh, I've talked about this before, but Akatosh very much seems like a cross between the time god and elements of Shor that kind of had to be removed when creating the religion, because obviously Shor was so aggressively pro-men, so aggressively anti-elven, so that when you see the face of the dragon and the face of the man in Akatosh, I kind of see that as the human elements of Shor or Shazar, whatever you want to call him, being kind of implemented into Akatosh. But yeah, it is weird with the dragon.
It's some interesting... I think a lot of people ask us, actually, I've seen this question around a bit, and it's about like what are the sort of real gods. And the problem is in the Elder Scrolls, it's all subjective, and you can't actually go the real god, because especially when you look at, like, if you're just working off the 8 divines, like, they were a creation. Like, if you were looking at maybe the realest gods, you could go to perhaps the first religions. Like, if we're not talking about the Daedra, in just the Aedra, the earliest religions, so maybe some of the Nordic ones and the Elven ones, you can go like Aldmerian gods of men or so on. But even then, they are so subject to interpretation and what you sort of put onto them, and they don't have that sort of conscious presence like the Daedra. So there is no real way to go like, what is the real god? Because some would go like, oh, Kinnereth is a weaker form of Kine, but then I'm sure there are Nords and stuff out there that are like, no, they're separate. In the same way that people could draw all kinds of like big mythic connections in the real world between like, storm gods and like Indra and Zeus and Thor and all whatnot, right? They could do that. But that doesn't mean some might accept the connections, but others might be like, no way, they're separate, they're different things. So it's kind of like, depends who you ask. You can't get a concrete answer, because you can't, unless you have like, the metaphysical knowledge of the universe injected straight into your brain. Like, you can't.
The Godhead is the only God.
Well, yeah.
Well, and one more thing about the dragons, like obviously with the Dragon War, there's a lot of anti-dragon sentiment going around. But do you think the Nords still fundamentally would have worshipped the time god dragon, even though Alduin seems to have, like the physical manifestation of Alduin seems to have forsaken his role in the world and gotten greedy? Do you think they would see that as a corruption on the dragon as opposed to the dragon being
Could be. Like, do you
bad?
know what you could actually, another thing we got to consider too about like the politics of the time, they had to create, like, worshipping the elven gods would have been heresy. So if you change it to something like this 8 divines, while it might not be like, oh, like the best things for the Nords, it's only the Nords living in Cyrodiil, because remember at the time Skyrim is still independent, and in Skyrim they're probably just worshipping their Nordic gods like they were for a long time, like separate, and really they don't really change until King Borgus and the sort of Elysian Order has a temporary influence, but then even Ismail Wulfarth comes back and brings back the Nordic pantheon. So I guess they, for a long time, like a lot of the Nords wouldn't all of a sudden convert to the 8 divines. Perhaps some did, the ones that exist there, but the 8 divines is a religion that is not, antithetical to. It's just like, oh, it's okay. They can do what they want to do, but it's not worshipping the elven gods. You know what I mean? So maybe that's a bit of a different way to look at it. So they don't, I guess, have to. They can still recognize.
Well, it's a massive benefit to them. Like if you were to just look at Tamriel as a whole, and you have Cyrodiil, and it's like, oh, this is a whole elven worship area, and then it goes, actually, now it's not. Like they'd still be happy. Yeah, absolutely. But are there any more points we want to talk about broadly about the divines?
Well, I guess while we're talking about the foundation of it, we've kind of gone into Akatosh, so maybe we should just start with Akatosh and focus on that.
Akatosh, the insane god, supposedly.
The splintered
As
god,
you're saying, there's 2 faces and all these different aspects merged together. Part of this aspect wants to undo time and destroy it, and the other one is all about kind of respecting time and the cycles. One of them loves men, one of them's an elven god that hates men.
Well, it's all interpreted.
There's a lot of,
and especially when you bring in the whole Marikati selectives dancing atop the towers that brought about the Middle Dawn, which kind of changed things and according to them, removed the elven elements from Akatosh and then hence split them, which it's still hard to really understand what it is in terms of lore. I think I generally like to just look at it still as this one sort of time god archetype, and then look at the different versions of it, and then you can build that whole the sort of Akka concept of the different, the insane god, the time stuff, all of that. But you just can't really get an idea that Akatosh confirmed split from Auriel, so Auriel's a separate being entirely. You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to work.
Yeah, they're different interpretations of the same thing, and that's the crazy thing about Dragon Breaks is we think about what that entails, but it is quite literally breaking Akatosh. It's breaking the dragon and stopping the passage of linear time in a place where that is the structure that forms the whole realm and forms the whole universe. Without it, everything gets kind of screwed up. So, no wonder Akatosh is a bit nuts.
But overall, no matter what sort of interpretation, he generally has something to do with time and being leader of the pantheon, essentially.
And I suppose being a newer god than, say, Auriel, the same kind of creation stories don't seem to exist in the Divines pantheon. You have Auriel and Auriel's bow and shooting the heart of Lorcan and all of that. They don't talk about Akatosh when they...
I guess that's another
with
thing.
Any of that. It's just very vague.
That's another thing I guess we should talk about, just to preface that when you're typically elven pantheons and elven beliefs is what you call Anuic, meaning basically not looking favorable upon creation. They thought it was big Lorcan's trick and so on, and we've been betrayed and everything, and now we're stuck here in mortality. Whereas what they call, what you can use as a term for Patamaic, as in the other side of the coin, is very favorable creation. And they're yes, the gods loved us and created us, and we were created by the gods, not descended from the gods. But the 8 divines and Imperial religion and Nordic religion all have that core underlying belief. They don't believe that these 8 divines, were betrayed or something. They believe they were created willingly, because I think it's the song, Shazar's song is the text, I think, or something like that. And it explains Shazar's place in the thing, but it's sort of Shazar came to the gods and sort of showed them all the beautiful things they could create with life, so they sacrificed their own power to sort of create mortality and so on. So it was a positive experience. So, and that's underlies their entire religion, because that's I guess get down to the fundamentals. So their creation story changes substantially.
The simple involvement of Shazar or Shor or Lorcan in the pantheon as a worship god makes it kind of innately Patamaic. Simply viewing favorably creation is is a bad thing to elves, and that's why Lorcan will always be. He'll never be, even though he's a bad deity to them, he's never going to be worshipped or considered a part of their pantheon. So that is the unusual thing about Shazar. Shazar is a recognized god in the imperial religion, but is not included in the 9 divines, or at least not openly.
Yeah.
You know, if it is, it's
and
snuck in there.
It could have been different much earlier as well. Like, you could argue that Riemann and Talos and so on, and these big figures of the Empire kind of took his place of reverence in a way anyway. Like, you know, I've even considered making a video on it before, but I'd have to work it out. But basically, there's this sort of idea that Talos is not like mantling Lorcan, but he's like the functional sort of, you know, replacement for, and the same as like Shazar. Like, so Shazar was like, you know, pro-man, and he was sort of what, you know, started this whole thing off. But then Talos has kind of become the living embodiment of him, kind of. But then there's all this Shazarine stuff, and it's, you know.
Yeah, he makes his will known through aspects called Shazarines, or, you know, different versions of him that pop up. You can't get rid of him completely, even if you tear out his heart and shoot it into the ocean. It's not gonna do the trick.
Yeah, but yeah.
I suppose we could move off Akatosh.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know there's all different interpretations, like Alkosh and the Khajiit religion, but we can hop on over to Arke, who says, "Honor the earth, its creatures and the spirits, living and dead. Guard and tend the bounties of the mortal world, and do not profane the spirits of the dead."
Yeah.
Ooh, life and death god.
I very much see him as fundamental to kind of almost enacting Akatosh's sphere. You know, it really focusing on the cycle of life and death, and not disrespecting it by seeking immortality through profane means, or, you know, the undead. All of this stuff, it breaks the cycle. It kind of disrespects time, and, you know, being a worshipper of Arke kind of guarantees you to respecting and taking part in the cycle of life and death, and, you know, not being afraid to die, and knowing that you'll come back eventually, and the, you know, the cycle goes on and on.
Yeah. What do you guys think about his origin, one of his potential origins as a mortal? Because I think it's a rather fanciful story, just because, like, at the creation of Arke as one of the 8 divines, this is way back in the first era, and the sort of tone of the book of like, oh, it's a shopkeeper, and sort of, it seems a bit more modern civilization.
I don't buy it at all.
And
I don't buy it, but it's cool.
It could easily be an example. You know how, like, people, like, obviously when King Arthur was first written about, they're writing about it kind of like, you know, with modern technology. Well, to them, modern technology, they're all knights in shining armor, but, like, the time period they're talking about is, like, very different in the reality of it.
Yeah, he essentially becomes an archetype. Yeah. Like, you know what King Arthur, for example, represents, and say there are, you know, King Arthur could actually be a dozen different kings in the old Britain times, doing certain things, and their stories kind of get embodied into one being who just resembles these chivalric values, etc., etc. And Arke, his role, the idea that he was just a shopkeeper doesn't really make sense for his actual origins, but it kind of does align with what he represents, and the idea, you know, and it's just kind of a good story.
Being a mortal himself and experiencing it kind of also, you know, you can kind of gives a better understand of the mortal cycle, and having lived and dying yourself, and like, so it's like thematically it assists who. I mean,
the monomyth is the more realistic but boring suggestion, which is that he was just one of the first spirits to crystallize after the start of time. The shopkeeper one, just for people who don't know it, was that he was this shopkeeper who was just obsessed with, like, knowledge and learning, and he just constantly was just trying to understand this book, which was written in some weird language, and he just got, like, so absorbed in it that he ignored everything around him. Then he realized it explained life and death itself, but he spent so much time with his head in this book, he was, like, about to die with an incurable plague, and then he prays to Mara, and it's Mara who says to him, "I'll make you Arke, basically, and you'll be this god living forever, but in charge of the cycles of life and death, or you can die." And he chose to be Arke, apparently.
Yeah, he's Arcade's got more interesting interpretations than some of the other pantheons, but I will say I do like, if you look at because there's ideas that the sort of celestial bodies or planets in the sort of universe in Mundus are, representations of the gods themselves, so they can call a planet Arcade. But when Manamako ascended to godhood in the warp in the west, he became manifest as the necromancer's moon, which orbits Arcade, and then it eclipses him once every 8 days, shining a purple light called the Shade of the Revenant, and I'm pretty sure that's how they make the black soul gems and so on. But that's a really cool... I just like the idea of just, the god of life and death having this sort of spiteful moon going around him, trying to you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that is cool. And it's interesting too, because that's kind of in Oblivion, in the sense that you have the shrines and stuff that they're making the black soul gems with. But then you also have Manamako appearing in the flesh in the game saying, I am Manamako. But
and then you kind of get into the Dragon Break. He's the god form and the one reality where he's immortal, and the two things split. So he both became the Necromancer's moon, but then also remained immortal, which is the one you fight in Oblivion. But it kind of gets a bit whack. There's a lot... Look, everyone who's listened to this podcast for a while now knows that if you're interested in the lore, you have to create a lot of copes for bad writing. You have to. That's the art form, and the unreliable narrator, you can work with it because of that. But yeah.
Well, before we officially started this podcast, I said, let's roleplay as gods, and you two both said Dibella at the same time.
Yeah, Dibella. Dibella sounds like the best. If I was in a cult, I'd be in the cult of Dibella, in all of them. Well, it's just beauty and art, and widespread cults are dedicated to both healing and sexual instruction. It sounds like the most hippie, beautiful existence, kind of peaceful, kind of. You know what I mean? It sounds really cool. And one thing I like about Dibella, which is interesting, I feel like here's a little take. Dibella as a being of beauty and art and all of these kind of things that exist within the mortal experience and life and so on. And she is a god that seems to have her origin with men and the Nordic pantheon and so on, and doesn't really appear in elven pantheons. So that kind of place there is kind of you can kind of see an underlying appreciation for life, whereas elven gods don't like it. They're not, or elves generally are they're, scorn.
They're not about being paid in moans, the elves.
Yeah.
They're too boring.
And I mean, they're definitely, she's always going to get a bad rap, because you're always going to have very pious people who are just it's just a sex cult. But it's just but there's so much more to it.
And
but that stigma's never going to be removed.
Because obviously in a world where we live, where Christianity has been so successful and its sort of attitudes towards sexual interaction and so on, whereas if you go to back to the Romans, which is very clearly what a lot of this is kind of connected to, is or influenced by, had different attitudes towards sex and purity and stuff, and things wouldn't, it's what I mean, the whole idea of sexual purity and so on might not, and I would probably say in the Elseworlds probably does not apply, but could with certain groups or so on. There's different ways of standards too, outside of the kind of Christian version of it, or traditional Christian, or old Christian, whatever you want to call it, but you know what I'm getting at. So whereas you might not find it, the problem with it, for example, that others might have, might not be that, it's a devious kind of sexual thing that is happening elsewhere. It's actually that it's about the indulgence and not valuing things righteousness or work or
it's the
piety.
distraction, as the Khajiit would say, it makes you stray from the path.
Yeah. So the actual grievance is with the sort of indulgent sort of lifestyle and kind of thing that's associated with it, as opposed to the actual sexual purity.
What about a priest of Arcade saying you're not respecting the cycle of life and death because you're doing it recreationally?
Well, one way I look at Dibella, at least in the imperial perspective, is I think she merges perfectly fine with Mara's sphere, because the way I kind of imagine it is that, Mara is about marriage and responsibility to your partner and procreation and kind of like fertility and all of this stuff. But then Dibella is like, oh, yeah, there's more than just the duty and responsibility of marriage and whatnot. There's, also being in love and being passionate about your relationship. It facilitates Mara's sphere. So they kind of work perfectly. It's like, the crops are only going to grow if they're fertilized.
And let's
attitude.
I agree. And I guess we can't forget the art component of Dibella as well, which is, a big component. May not sound as interesting, but it's there. I mean, she has the brush of true paint artifact that we saw in Oblivion, which can be used to literally paint things into reality, which I think is very cool, as much as I don't like fighting painted trolls.
There's the other thing too, is just about the difference between monotheism and I guess polytheism and so on, is that in a monotheistic religion, you're just sort of worshipping the one and following their kind of codes and so on. Whereas in religions such as this, with lots of different gods, you invoke them for different reasons, and if you were some artist, Dibella would be beneficial to you, or someone that you would invoke and pray to and want her blessings and so on, or
I was just thinking that praying to invoking the muse.
I mean, arguably you can even say that Catholics, for example, on saints and so on, is done somewhat I don't know, pray to or whatever you would reference. I don't know the intricacies of it, but there are patrons of XYZ and artists or something, then you give offering to this saint or something like that for that. But in this, it's a god.
Exactly.
Yeah. But she teaches, no matter the seed, if the shoot is nurtured with love, will the flower not be beautiful? So it's a very all-inclusive seeming.
What's her little symbol? The Elder Scrolls Online emblem? I just can't. Am I?
Isn't it a flower?
Being silly here? No, but what's that attached to? See the thing with the blue?
I think it's like a bud of a flower, I assume.
I'll tell you what, it looks like a pomegranate to me. It looks like a blue pomegranate.
But yeah, flowers and petals and stuff have generally been her kind of deal. And I don't know. I just feel it's cool. I like, even in ESO, the Dibellan doll masks. If you sort of scroll down the wiki there and have a look, it's just kind of all these beautiful sort of Venetian kind of masks. And you can imagine all of the cool art that would come from her cults and so on.
And I like her representation as a moth in the Nordic pantheon. Just the idea of these bright and beautiful coloured wings with many colours on it.
A beautiful moth drawn to the light of inspiration. But
so there's more to it's more to her than just a bit of sex. Don't write her off.
But now let's go to Julianos, god of logic, wisdom, and the arts of magic.
Yeah, Julianos is a god that seems to have definitely fallen out of favor with Nordic religion, like Junal.
He's a bit of an incel. Look, there's no time for art and beauty and sex when you got logic,
literature, and contradiction, boys. Associated with magic, often revered by wizards. Like I'm saying, Junal, Nordic father of language and mathematics, isn't so popular anymore. I guess the Dibella cult kind of kicked him out. But yeah, Julianos is one of those divines that isn't particularly interesting, but kind of needs to be there to have all the... It's fire, wind, earth, and then it's okay, we just need this one because it's another element.
He's filling the place. He is a school teacher god is the kind of vibe I get from him. I just think of
when they say he falls out of favor, well, I don't think it actually gives a specific time frame, but I tend to think it's the magical aspect of him that has somewhat fallen out of favor, because for example, after the Oblivion Crisis and the kind of breakdown of magical institutions, and people start to look skeptically at magic like it's associated with the Daedra, and I think that might be part of why he's been a bit shunned.
Yeah, in the Nordic one specifically, it's that I think it's overall the attitudes when you have Junal, and it's he was the god of hermetic orders and the clever men and stuff, whereas the art of the clever men sort of became less revered over time, and I guess magic got associated more with the devious elves, and then obviously that even gets more amplified as things go on.
Yeah, because by the time of Skyrim, all the Nordic gods have fallen out of favor.
But remember, magic to the Imperials, the Imperial battle mage archetype, or as a unit in their thing, is very important. So you can see how, like, knowledge of magic and so on has been part of their thing. But look,
so he represents learning, scholarship, justice. His domains include alchemy, enchantment, sorcery. I do like the thing he is said to incant the damned equation.
Yeah.
That's cool.
2 out of 10 snooze fest. Let's move it on. Kinnereth, let's go.
Okay.
Kinnereth's cool.
Her role is somewhat kind of not downplayed, but watered down when it comes to the Imperial Pantheon. It's mostly just an association with the elements and
nature.
And the weather and nature, as opposed to her fundamental role in human society.
Like, Kain is far more interesting, I think, and is more heavily involved in the Nord's religion, whereas, like you're saying, Kinnereth is, I don't know, nothing particularly interesting.
And it's also too, like, her cool stuff kind of, even like now they recognize, like, Kinnereth, obviously, or / Kain as the mother of the demigod Morahouse, but it's like she was sort of known as Kain back then, like it was kind of pre-formation of the 8 divines anyway. And look, to be honest, Kinnereth specifically, not Kain and the other interpretations, which are much cooler in my opinion, is just the nature god filling that out in the pantheon, the god of heavens, winds, rains. You remember, there's even when you go and get the boots of the Crusader, and like one of the challenges, you're not supposed to fight back at the bear or something attacking you, or the Spriggan or something. That's the challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when the pilgrim didn't fight back, having reverence for nature, Kinnereth allowed them entrance to the grotto where the boots were hidden. And wearing the boots means that the creatures of the forest won't attack you anyway. I mean, at least Kinnereth's the mother of Morahouse, the demigod. That's kind of cool.
But you can imagine some cool things, like an army, like, praying to her or something before they go on a march to, make sure the rain stay away, or favorable weather and stuff like that.
And merchants needing favorable winds to travel to sell their wares and things like that.
To be honest, a lot of the divines seem rather, like, practical. Do you know what I mean? Like, they don't have a...
Well, as we said at the start, they kind of just revolve around useful functions of society, really.
I mean, like, kind of, too, the other thing is you can kind of, like, you could say that the 8 divines are almost, like, reduced to the archetypes the most. Like, if we were talking about Adric archetypes and, like, a time god or whatever, it's like Akatosh feels like the most, I guess, like, base time god. Like, he doesn't have an elven flavor to him, or he doesn't have some, like, Nordic kind of...
Was it based or base time god?
Just base.
Just the base time
Well,
god.
You do have to kind of tear away the stories from these gods. Like, for example, with Kain, the Nords believe that when it rains, it's her tears mourning over the loss of shore. And that would have been one of those aspects where it's like Alicia coming up with the religion. We can't really have that if we want to appease the elven elements of things. So we kind of, as you said, boil it down to the basic sphere, the basic aspect of what they represent, and take away a lot of the context.
I think you need to be careful, Drew. I can see your Witcher necklace swinging in the background.
I'm knocking against this.
It's almost as if she's sending an earthquake to come and teach you a lesson.
That'd be me fidgeting too much, but
Well, how about?
But Kinnereth basically is a bit boring. Kinnereth.
How about we look at Mara? Mara's cool. Everyone likes Mara. You have to be a bit weird to not like Mara.
Mother figure,
goddess of love, agriculture, compassion, fertility. Interesting agriculture is there. I suppose it makes sense, but I always associate that with the Zenithar a lot more.
Well, it's kind of more so the I guess, just fertility broadly, as in the fertility of the land, fertility
like nurture,
of the womb, everything, like, it's related to growing new life. But she's obviously really closely intertwined with marriage ceremonies, as you know, in Skyrim, and it's sort of, she seems to be like the marriage god, really.
Yeah.
On top of other things. Also, interestingly, I think it's the elves that they believe that she was the wife of Auriel, whereas in the Nordic one, she is the handmaiden to Kine and concubine to Shor, as well. So Mara is a figure that's seen as like in relation to like the chief of the gods or whatever. But so in a way, she is like a. If you looked at like Alduin or Auriel or Shor as the father figure of their respective pantheons, you could kind of see her as somewhat of a important mother figure kind of.
Yeah. Mummy Mara.
Yeah. Well, except I guess Kine in the Nordic one kind of takes that, but she's like the extra one though. She's a concubine, and you can make cool figures of that.
She's the side chick.
The side piece.
Yeah.
Divine commands mortals to live soberly and peacefully, honor your parents, and preserve the peace and security of home and family.
It is a bit, and do your homework, isn't it? It's very...
But you can kind of go like you could see, we were talking about like stuff with Debella. You could see how, for example, things of erotic instruction and all of that kind of sort of sex cult stuff could pull away people from what Mara's more sacred duties of like sort of family, hearth and home and love and like connection or something like that. It can, not saying it necessarily has to, just what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I was trying to think, because a lot of things that are interesting about Mara are her interpretations in other culture, like Mora with the red guards.
Yeah,
well, definitely a fertility goddess with multiple arms, I think.
She has many arms trying to grab different husbands and grab more and so on. But what's interesting there, again, like that's another sort of marriage sort of connection brought onto her.
It's also on the side thing too, like grabbing other people's husbands.
Well, that's kind of, it's a cool part about the red.
Or are they just men? Are they husbands that are already husbands, or is she like making them?
Well, I guess it's sort of referring to like a polyamory, like a husband being like, quite literally. Yeah. So, but it's kind of a different dynamic, one that you don't really see, like a reverse harem, or lots of dudes to give you lots of kids, but.
I don't think it works that way.
What?
Lots of dudes to give you lots of kids.
Yeah, like different flavors of kid,
I guess so.
You just... Because you take the different husbands. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm just saying that the incubation. I mean, I don't know if she has 4 of anything else.
She's a god,
only
bro.
Got 4 arms, so...
Or maybe she has 4 worms or more.
4 incubators, yeah, maybe. Who knows? That's beast.
Just gotta get that bread in the oven. She's a full-on bakery. She's just churning out sourdough and
nice
some cakes too.
Stendhal wouldn't be happy with all this.
Oh no.
God of mercy, though, charity, well-earned luck, and justice, unless of course you are like a Daedra or undead, in which case you will get no mercy whatsoever, and he will want you wiped from the world.
Yeah. And we know he has his vigilance of Stendhal as one example of like people who go out and crusade. Like he seems like, you could kind of say like a crusader god, like, at least, and I wonder how much it's abused essentially in the same way that like, the call to the real crusades and so on was like, heavily abused for land stealing and stuff like that. You could, that righteous cause and justice honestly, justice and righteousness a lot of the time, it's red flag. Like if you hear it, like it's
good intentions pave the path to to hell or something.
The road to hell's paved with good intentions.
But especially when it's involved with the Imperials, I like the aspect of him that is kind of related to keeping rulers in check, like his idea of righteous rule by might and by might, as you said, bit of a red flag, but merciful forbearance. So the idea that the gods aren't just telling the serfs what to do. It's like, no, the most powerful people in the kingdom, also in the empire, also need to follow the gods and not become corrupt, and follow the rule of law and be a merciful, good emperor. So I do like that aspect of him, but that probably gets ignored a bit when it's convenient.
Yeah, but go among the infirm and wounded wherever you may find them. Do not hoard wealth or indulge physically. And you could say it's like, that's, they're good things you should do, but I feel like a lot of the emperors that model themselves, like, they definitely indulge Definitely hold well. I don't know if it's kind of like, the idea versus the execution, I think.
It is interesting as well that he seems to not really acknowledge worshippers, like, or distinguish between worshippers and heretics. Like, he kind of treats everyone fairly, but he still wants, obviously, you to worship him like any god would. But he doesn't seem to be like a big favorite playing deity.
It's interesting too, and we've kind of talked about this, but like through the Elven and Nordic lens, through the Elven lens, he's seen as an apologist of men, which is, a kind of mercy, apologizing for men's misgivings to the elves, really. But, and then in the reverse, it's like he's a god of ransom, which is kind of like the hardcore Nordic version of a mercy, telling them how to take on war prisoners instead of just killing everyone. So I guess he's a healthy middle ground, Stender. In that regard. And he's got a cool symbol, like the whole cup pouring a drink out. It's just an interesting little...
Like a holy grail.
Yeah. Like I'm just glad it's not like the scales, you know what I mean? Like Lady of Justice kind of looking thing.
Yeah, true.
Something different.
All right. We got...
Xanathar. I think he is by far the most, like... forgotten. Like if when I used to
the least fleshed out,
I forget about him relatively well, not regularly because we write and talk about him so much, but when I was a kid, Xanathar would be like the one I would forget.
Yeah.
Like is
oh, that's such a rip. I mean, I like the whole idea that he is associated with the Bosmeri god Zan.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, I'm pretty sure, like an agriculture god. Yeah. God of toil, agriculture, payment in kind, but also vengeance to them, which is interesting. Perhaps I could see some kind of traditional eye for an eye elements there in vengeance. But he is very much a god of work and commerce, and the whole concept of like, you get ahead in life by working hard and being fair and honest, and not through war, bloodshed, or theft. But he's
kind of an important god to stop rebellions and things like that. Just if you work the fields all day in the hot beating sun, keep at it because you'll be rewarded for it.
He's the god of capitalism.
Kind of. But he does have that more religious element of like honest work, like that real honest profit.
Honest work for the farmers and the guys that worship him, like sitting there with their big coffers full of like trade and commerce and gold, and they're like,
the god of stocks.
It's interesting that he's also seen as a warrior god, although one who apparently is restrained and reserved in times of peace.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to remember all of these divines are through the context of a continent-spanning empire whose entire work is conquering other people and taking their provinces.
Of course,
we've talked about this before, and one day we'll do it why the empire are not these good guys, these super good guys, they do. Everyone is very anti-imperialism and anti-empires in the modern world and so on, but they seem to kind of forget that this is what's happening to them.
It's very easy to paint the Stormcloaks as some very they're just a bunch of silly racist types. And I mean, a lot of them are very xenophobic, but you can imagine how would you feel if some other kind of faction, I suppose, came to your province or country, told you couldn't worship your god, and had agents roaming around that would it's like 1984 kind of thought police. If they find you, they're going to take you away and kill you.
Were they ever that bad? Huh? Were they ever that bad in the places where they...
Well, I'm talking about with
Talos.
Literally, by the time of Skyrim, there's Thalmor agents that they've permitted to walk around in Skyrim, capture Nords who worship Talos, and take them away.
And look, some people will go they've been part of the Empire for ages and all of that kind of stuff. But it's Scotland's been... Scotland or Ireland, for example, there's a lot of people there would very much like their independence or their own cultural sort of things, but they've been...
Right, enough of that.
The Englishman...
Just to add to the Talos point, I feel like I would put most of the blame for that on the Aldmeri Dominion over the Empire. I think if the Empire were... had a I'm talking about them like they're this monolith, but obviously it depends on who's in power and who's on the council and who's the emperor.
Empire, but
I feel like the Empire is not going to be imposing, torture and death penalty for worshipping Talos. And other examples of them, I'm not saying imperialism is a good thing, but spreading into other continents, they tend to do it with some grace. Like, for example, like looking at Black Mush, things didn't go that well, but the idea is they put in infrastructure. They don't try to mess with the local cultures too much. They try to integrate it and try to
like
just make...
they couldn't in Black Marsh.
And same as Morrowind.
Like put it in
partially,
Morrowind, they install a puppet king, and if you look at the political trajectory of Morrowind in the time since it was conquered, compared to the 400 years later or whatever, by the end of the Third Era, it was going in a very different place.
Yeah, look, my whole
All
point.
I'm saying is it's not like crazy dogmatic, worship
No,
our gods.
it's
If you
not.
worship
It's
someone
not.
who's not out,
You're right.
That's
It's not that. But my point was simply just that the Empire is so much worse than everyone thinks, and they definitely do go into other cultures' territories and change things.
Yeah, it's simply put, it's the same as the Roman Empire. A lot of their motivations it's not like a religious crusade or dominance or anything like that. They just go in for economic reasons, fund some wars, go take bounty, control new places, new resources.
It's just not black and white like a lot of people are very much like, oh yeah, the Empire is the good guys and the Stormcloaks are the bad guys, and it's like
100%.
there's
I totally agree
there's
with
some
that.
nuance there.
Yeah, like
There's
a good,
some nuance
a
there.
good game is look at the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, and that's all about the resistance to Tiber Septim's empire, and actually shows you the other side, and it's like he's not coming in
And to add to that, to unleash a giant brass god on the Somerset Isles to bring them on.
it's the equivalent of like a nuke in our real world in terms of destruction, way more even like. If you believe the outer canon sort of lore, they're like unleashing 1,000 years of broken time war with mirror logicians or whatnot.
Oh yeah.
But even not like, then he goes around and uses the Numidium to purge unloyal families and stuff like that. Like, Tiber Septim was a bastard, bro. he's an awful dude.
Well, I think that's the perfect segue to talk about Talos.
Tell us.
The final divine, if you would like to include 9 divines in your list.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's kind of like there is obviously. I don't think the Aldmeri Dominion are just trying to stop his worship or so on, but like he is a god, a divine essence, like the story of Daggerfall and how it all plays out. Like he most certainly has like some sort of divinity for sure. But yeah, like we've kind of touched on this before, that Tiber Septim, or Talos as he's known, becomes like a sort of god or focus point for like other emperors to aspire to, and for sort of he is like a divine manifestation of the empire itself. But one thing that really gripes me, and I think I was loading up Oblivion recently, and then in one of the lines or something, it's like, oh, the Septim Empire is like direct descendants of Tiber Septim. They're not. Like the entire Septim is not direct at all.
And that's a loading screen too, which is meant to be considered canon.
This is the kind of myth they could run with, I guess, though. You never know the modern world. Or this is the other thing. This is kind of contrived, but like some ancient people and older groups had different understandings of like hereditary lines and so on. A lot of the time, it's like not necessarily, not a lot of the time, but some of the time, not necessarily just straight up like blood and genetics related. Like we're looking back at things from a very genetic kind of, like for example, like blood bonds and blood brothers and so on. In a lot of cultures, were treated very literally as brothers. It was the same as a genetic brother when you make those bonds. It's because they didn't have like some genetic understanding. They're looking at it for a more like religious kind of spiritual, cultural kind of connection. And when you make, that kind of connection. So in that same way, there's examples of like different ideas of, how they could work it. I don't know, like how the you know what I mean? They're headcanoning that they're a direct descendant, but if you look at the actual like timeline, that everyone's descended functionally from Tiber Septim's brother, on his Tiber Septim's niece, really, is the next crowned Kintara.
Well, and the idea that Tiber Septim deserves a place amongst the divines is kind of weird when you've got Riemann, who is... He's a cultural god. He's a cultural hero to the Imperials, and really, it makes sense that Tiber Septim would be the same. but it's definitely these kind of other elements of Talos that make Talos what Talos is, that is kind of sneaking into the Divines. It's definitely a bit of Shaw or Lorcan's work.
Well,
going
remember,
on.
and just to keep bear in mind, like obviously, if when you play the games or read the lore, like you can get all of the heresies and the stories and the backstory and stuff. But the typical, if you go around to the Imperials or if you go to the Stormcloaks today and so on, they believe that Tiber Septim was such a great man, the Talos of Atmora, that he literally just turned into a god because he's so cool. In the same way that's how a lot of the that people believed that Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothosil were created. They achieved apotheosis by just being so like, whoa, enlightened and boom. Like they don't have, like, it's not part of their scripture that they, murdered Nerevar and stole the heart of Lorcan in the same way that it's not in the scripture that, that's why the Arcturian is a heresy. It's not.
Yeah. It is interesting to read some of the reasons they come up with by the time of Skyrim as to why worshipping Talos was a mistake, like the Talos Mistake book, and it's like very pandering to the Thalmor. It says our Thalmor friends who may we find centuries of peace and prosperity with our new Thalmor friends. But basically they say worshipping Talos was a mistake because it basically distracted them from the 8 who are more important. It pushed people away from the 8 divines, the true gods who do deserve our love and reverence, and all focusing way too much on Talos, who weakened the memory of the man Tiber Septim.
I mean, it's the kind of thing, it's like, I don't necessarily disagree either, because Talos has never been my, favorite god or anything. Like, I didn't, you know what I mean?
We've got a bunch of Thalmor supporters. Blink twice if you've if you've been captured.
Well, one thing, like tying it back to what we said near the beginning, is it is kind of important to the Divine's religion that there be a fairly strong disconnect between the mortals who worship them and the gods themselves. They're very disassociated from the people because the idea is they sacrifice their power to create the world and to maintain it. And with the exception of a few serious instances, they don't really meddle at all. Whereas with Talos, you've got this figure who was a part of many of these people's lives. They know all of these stories. They've got all of these interactions with him. So, yeah, if he does join the Divines, he does become the centerpiece because, while all the others are just chilling and not really getting involved, if they can even get involved, Talos is a big part of human society.
Sorry. Okay, because you've got just a joke to say. How about you say it?
No, it's not a joke. It's actually interesting is that in Morrowind, there's an avatar of Tiber Septim / Talos called Wolf. And he actually, I just like his opinion. He says, the Emperor is getting old. Don't know how much longer he'll hang on. So is the whole Empire, for that matter. Getting old, that is. The Emperor and the legions have held the Empire together for hundreds of years. It's been a good thing, by and large. But maybe it's time for a change. Time for something young and new. What? No idea, because I'm old. Old dog doesn't get new ideas. But maybe young folks like you should try some new ideas. I don't know. Could be messy, but change is never pretty. But it's just interesting that, if you were to take that as complete truth and so, it's kind of like Talos, giving up. He's like, yeah, whatever, the Empire's dead, gone. He's done it because he doesn't care, man. He's a god now. You can imagine that kind of thing, and this is the sort of working theory behind a lot of Kim stuff anyway, is that when you become so divine and so all powerful, you become estranged from the petty, creating.
But what
an
about
empire
the whole
seems
idea?
petty
What
by
about the whole
comparison.
idea that the Thalmor kind of want to kill Talos by killing the worship of him because entities receive power through worship? Wouldn't he care about that?
Well, there's the kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hard to work it in with all of the Kim stuff and so on, because it gets really complicated and contrived. In the same way that Vivek, Kim God Vivek is different to living God Vivek.
Okay.
It goes on.
It gets a bit bit crazy. I was going to say anyway before that Talos, I can see how Talos would become a very tempting god. Because let's be real, a lot of the other ones are pretty generic, and then you've got this god that's basically I was like you and I ascended to godhood. It's this very ambitious, maybe I can become a god too if I do good deeds and conquer the world. And
he's got a good
things
story,
like that.
a good backstory,
Yeah.
good personality,
Yeah.
Plus, to answer your question as well, Michael, if we buy into the idea that Talos is kind of the mingled aspects of these different figures, one of which being Wolfhalf being an aspect of Shaw, if the elves are trying to get rid of Talos worship, it's absolutely in Shaw's interest to kind of keep staying relevant and staying a part of things, and to continue undermining the elves at every turn.
Yeah.
So Talos worship will cause conflict beyond just this civil war in Skyrim, so long as
Kind of
Shaw's
what we were talking
involved.
about before is like that Talos could be like the, metaphysical like rebirth or reincarnation of Shaw. Like if you go with the idea that, Xeronarctus and Izmir and all that were different, like Shezarines or whatnot, and the three kind of like pieces kind of come back into Talos. And then there's all these kind of other theories that you can kind of go like Talos, it manifests like a Shezarine, being related to the last Dragonborn, and him being a manifestation of all that, and staving off the end of the world, but yada yada. But that's all gets into like a lot of crazy theory stuff. But
I suppose that brings us to the end of the Divines.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very interesting podcast coming next where we're going to be going through a bunch of your questions. So definitely stay tuned for that. Social media links are down in the description below, as is a link to buy some Fudge Muppet merch if you want to get a sick t-shirt like this one. And Scott, finish the outro.
Bye. See you all. See you next time.